Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Okay, welcome everyone to the first session of the Battle for Prosperity, and actually the first session at the Battle of Ideas 2008. Now, this session is going to be focusing on China and India, catching up on the West. I'll introduce the speakers shortly, but before I begin, if I could introduce you to Stuart Simpson, who produced this strand of talks alongside Kerry Dingle, who's also sitting down at the front here from WorldRight. And Stuart's going to talk for about 5 minutes about the concept behind the Battle for Prosperity, and also the Emerging Economies Forum, which he runs with the Institute of Ideas. Stuart.
Hello. Okay, I'll just show. I'm not going to talk for 5 minutes. A lot shorter than that. As Chad said, my name's Stuart Simpson. I'll co-produce this session with Strand of Debate with Patrick and Kerry over there. First of all, I'd like to thank the sponsors for this debate, SAB Miller and BT, without whom we wouldn't be able to put on the debate today, so thank you for our sponsors. And today's strand, is a continuation of a year's debates and discussions that we've been having in the Emerging Economies Forum. And today should really be seen as a continuation of this. We set up the Emerging Economies Forum last year after last year's Battle of Ideas, specifically after a strand of debates that we organised called the Battle for Africa, where we looked at debates and arguments about development within Africa today. And what we really thought we needed was a forum in which we could pursue a pro-growth critique of development today, rather than calling for growth to be qualified as sustainable growth or pro-poor growth or appropriate growth. And it's really in this spirit which we hope today's debates will continue. So with that, I'll just hand back to Patrick Hayes, who will introduce today's session.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Now, the first thing I'd actually like to just point out is that all of you on your chairs should have one of these forms here. And this is actually for the third session, which is the Emerging Economies question time, that will be taking place at 3:30 this afternoon. Now, all the questions are going to be, really, if you want to ask a question and you get some kind of inspiration in this session, do write it down here and make sure you hand it to someone after this session, so we can make sure they're all prepared for the final session of today. But without further ado, I'll introduce this session. So my name's Patrick Hayes, I'm from the Institute of Ideas, and the session here is the first session in Battle for Prosperity, and we're looking at the two most rapidly developing countries, and actually, well, two of the largest in the world, China and India. Now, despite the recent credit crunch, although the theories of decoupling that we heard earlier on this year, that China and India were actually going to continue growing at the same rate and really not be affected by the credit crisis in the US, has proven to be somewhat untrue. China's rapid growth at the moment has only slowed somewhat from about 11% to about 9%. So really we can still look at these as being very rapidly emerging economies and not something that's going to be too affected by the current crisis. But despite the rapid growth of these economies, there still seems that there's going to be a continuing gap for decades to come between the standard of living between the West and the emerging economies. Even China and India, there's still going to be large pockets of poverty. Even though China and India are projected to become the largest economies soon, there's going to be such as the Tata Nano car. There are methods that are being developed to allow a higher standard of living at a much lower purchasing power. So we've really got to unpick what's happening in China and India, with a view to kind of starting to examine the emerging economies as a whole over the day, and to start to think, are they actually catching up with the West, or is that actually over the next kind of, or is this are there fundamental problems that need to be overcome before that can take place? So I'll just introduce my speakers. Speaking first, to my far left, is Sundeep Kumar. Sundeep Kumar is currently the Director of Corporate Affairs and Communications at SAB Miller in India. And SAB Miller is one of the world's largest brewers and listed on the FTSE 100. Now, Sundeep has also won several international awards, such as India's first Cannes Silver Lion, the Advertising and Marketing Effectiveness Silver Awards at the New York Festival and has been recognised by the International Advertising Association for his professional contribution in the field of advertising, marketing and marketing communications. Now, he's a frequent guest speaker at a large range of Indian business institutions, and also his articles are featured in renowned professional journals such as Business Today, Business Standard Strategist, Advertising Works and A&M. So I'm very pleased to have Sundeep here today, flying over from India to speak for us. Secondly, we have Professor Adrian Wood. Now, from 2000 to 2005, Professor Wood was Chief Economist at the UK's Department for International Development. He's now the Professor of International Development at the University of Oxford, and his research focuses on the interactions between the global economy and national human resources. So I think his contribution is going to be very valuable in terms of looking at the situation in China and India at the moment. Up third is Phil Mullan, to my immediate right. Now, Phil is the author of The Imaginary Time Bomb, Why an Ageing Population is Not a Social Problem. He alternates and sometimes combines work as an economist with business management, and is currently working full-time as Director of Business Transformation with EasyNet, the corporate communication services company, but is speaking in a personal capacity today. Finally, we have Xiaolan Fu, who's the Director of the Sanjaya Lal Programme for Technology and Management for Development and Fellow of Green Templeton College. She's also co-leader of several EPSRC and ESRC funded projects and a Senior Research Associate at Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Fu is the author of Exports, Foreign Direct Investment and Economic Development in China, and serves on the editorial board of Oxford Development Studies and the International Journal of Technological Learning, Innovation and Development. So if we could just welcome our speakers, very fantastic. So each of the speakers is going to speak for 5 minutes. They're very keen to get out to audience questions, so we'll have about 10 minutes of questions just to get the debate started after that, and I'll go out immediately to the floor. But if I could start off with Sundeep. Stuart, give hand on Brody
Good morning, everybody. And I'm not starting by inviting questions, but to me, actually, the most important alphabet, or if you like, the most important thing in the title is actually the question mark. And I think that's a big question. I couldn't make it any bigger than that, but it's a very big question. By mid-century, China will overtake US, and India would have vaulted over Germany to be part of the economically dominant troika. In a span of just 15 years, Shanghai today has more skyscrapers than Manhattan. 38% of US multinationals are moving their research business to the east. Indian companies are showing a flair for producing high-quality products at amazingly low prices. The emigration of poor people to the West is slowing down as their citizens see hope in their own countries. Obama considers India a challenge in space, and China is becoming an economic colonizer in Africa. All eyes are looking east. Never has the world seen the simultaneous, sustained takeoff of two nations that together account for about a third of the planet's population. Never in history have so many people risen so fast. Yes, it's easy and tempting to get away with all these statements that one reads about in the papers every day, as China and India try and reclaim their place in history. There was a time not long ago that between these two countries they commanded 60% of the world's GDP. Before the British arrived in India, India had 30% of the world trade. So in a sense, I don't know whether these countries are trying to catch up with the West or trying to catch up with their past. But even the most optimistic GDP estimates today would be foolhardy to think that huge populations that are there in China and India can have the per capita incomes that lifestyles in the West are used to. This is how much food a family in Germany consumes in a month, by the way. or to try and imagine how many planets it would take to actually sustain such a lifestyle for 2.5 million people, even with the technological advancements that we have today. Western-driven economic activity over the last century has undoubtedly changed the climate, scalped forests, produced the first mass species extinction in our 65 billion years of history, and emptied the oceans of once common fish species. What will happen if the same model extends to the rest of the world? And today they're only talking about India and China. One day Africa will also start rising. One thing is for sure, in the coming decades, there will be a shift in the power balance, or at least a greater distribution of it. India and China will be able to pay for greater influence in world affairs and are likely to test America's commitment to global trade. The West will have to get used to a world where it is no longer the monopoly buyer of scarce resources. In the 19th century, Europe went through a similar trauma when another giant was rising, the US. But the US and other established powers will have to learn to make room for China and India. For almost in every dimension, as consumer markets, investors, producers, users of energies and commodities, these countries will be 21st century heavyweights. America should perhaps be as open-minded as Europe was 100 years ago. As India and China rise with their consumerist middle class in a world that has finite resources, it is easy to imagine that this century will be ravaged by the kind of economic rivalries and military conflicts that made the last century so violent. How these Asian giants integrate with the rest of the world, and how the rest of the world integrates with them, will really define and largely shape 21st century economy. For peace in this century depends on India and China finding a less calamitous and more sustainable way of becoming modern, or catching up with the West, that is. But let's not forget that both China and India are still desperately poor countries. Over 60% of their population earns less than $2 a day. They account for just a mere 6% of the world's GDP, which is half that of Japan today, despite all the hoopla that we hear. Nearly half of China's labor force remains in the agricultural sector. In India, it's about 60%. China is now one of the most unequal societies in the world. And these inequalities, particularly the rural-urban divide, are tending to create certain restiveness. China has yet to prove that it can go beyond forced mass industrialization. And China is in real danger of getting old before it gets rich. In India too, the pursuit of economic growth has created a gaudy elite and widened already alarming differences between the socioeconomic disparities. India's infotech industry, successful as it is, employs a mere 1 million people, while 200 million Indians still subsist at less than $1 a day. We have one of the largest reservoirs of technical personnel in India, but we also have the world's largest number of illiterates. Lifting them out of poverty will remain a Herculean task for decades to come. The good news in India comes not from the government, but from civil society and the private sector, who are increasingly embracing most of the government's tasks. The government at least is allowing them to do so, but little reform is happening within the government itself. For all the huge advantages they now have, India and China cannot assume that their role as superpowers is assured. They must keep growing rapidly just to provide jobs for tens of millions entering the workforce every year, and to keep many millions more from crashing back into poverty. In the words of noted economist Amartya Sen, process of economic growth is a rather poor basis for judging the progress of a country. It is not, of course, irrelevant, but it is only one of the many factors. The idea of development is dominated by the basic vision that poor countries are just low-income countries, and the focus is simply on transcending the problems of underdevelopment through economic growth. But development has to be concerned with advancing human well-being and freedom. Income is one of the factors that contributes, but not the only factor. To my mind, freedom, equality, literacy, nutrition, value for human life, respect for law and society, discipline, all go towards defining what the West stands for, as far as I am concerned. Unfortunately, these are a little more difficult to learn than English and mathematics. And without these, perhaps the only West we might land up catching with is the Wild West. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sundeep. Sorry, Martha, if you could, yeah. Adrian.
Well, like Sundeep, I'm going to start from the same question. Are China and India going to catch up to the West? And my answer is yes, they are unquestionably going to catch up, and in a more important sense than I think either Patrick or Sundeep have said. I'm not thinking about the aggregate size of these economies becoming as large as the United States. I'm thinking about the average standards of living, the per capita incomes of these countries catching up with the West. Yes, they are going to do that, if you take a moderately long view. Now, this is not new, and it is terrific. Sandy actually said, well, all that's really happening is that we're going to go back to the situation of the world as it was in about 1500, when China and India, in terms of prosperity per capita income, not just aggregates, were at roughly the same level as Europe. What's happened over the last 500 years is that for complicated reasons, they slipped behind. And now they're catching up again, but they're really just regaining the position they've had before. And in the meantime, of course, a bunch of European ex-colonies, like the United States, have moved up onto the same level as Europe as well. Now, can it be done? Yes, of course it can be done. Think about Japan. I mean, those of you who've been to the opera will remember that in about 1860, Lieutenant Pinkerton arrived on a black American battleship and impressed the hell out of the Japanese. He impressed some Japanese ladies, and he impressed the Japanese government. 80 years later, Japan took on and defeated the United States, Britain, France, and the Netherlands in East Asia. So it can be done. China is in the process of catching up probably faster than Japan did. So my guess is that by about 2050, perhaps before, China will have the same standard of living as the West. India is getting there a bit slower, but it will get there not much later. We're talking about a decade or so later. India's progress is actually accelerating. Now when I say get there, what's there going to be like? What's this world going to be like in which China and India have the same standard of living as the West? Well, one important thing is that the West, today's rich countries, are going to be richer than they now are, but not by anything like as much as you would imagine by extrapolating their growth rates over the past 30 years. And they'll be growing at 2-3% for 30 years. That's not going to go on. Two things are going to change that. One is a massive rise in the price of natural resources, and I'm thinking of oil at $500 a barrel. And the other is the erosion of the technological rents that the rich countries now have. I mean, they're able to have higher incomes, charge higher prices, because their goods are more technologically sophisticated than those of the Asian countries, India and China. That is changing fast. So that's one feature of the world that's worth mentioning. The other, which again is really just underscoring something that Sundeep said, is that China and India at this point are going to be the only two countries in the world that matter. Each of them is going to account for more than a fifth of world GDP and world population. Each of them is going to be 3 times as large as the United States, 3 times as large as Western Europe. Together, they're going to account for approaching half of world output. The only geopolitical issue at that point is going to be what is the nature of the relationship between India and China. And this is not going to be easy. These are two huge countries, bang next door, both of them very crowded, both of them resource scarce. You can see the potential for problems. You want a kind of downside view of what might happen? Go back and read 1984, not what actually happened to Winston Smith, but the kind of geopolitical background to all of that. And what worries me about this scenario most of all is that nobody seems to be thinking about it strategically, or at least nobody is thinking about it and talking about it in public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. So together, in fact. Move these round to you as well.
I need two, do I?
Just, would you
Three.
or-
I'm a very quiet person. I think this, can you hear? Yes. I'd like to pick up on the decoupling comment that Patrick mentioned in his introduction and spend my few minutes on that. Now, the decoupling thesis, the idea that the emerging economies in general, and Asia in particular, would be somehow immune from the impact of an American recession, or the impact of an American slowdown, or a general Western recession. That sort of thesis, one finds a lot of difficulty finding anyone who claims that they promoted it a couple of years ago. There are not many advocates who say that anymore. And that's understandable, of course, when we see the sort of events of the last 6 weeks, in particular, the last 2 or 3 months, where you've seen the ripple effects, or some say tsunami effects, but you know, the big storm which has gone across the world, impacting many emerging economies. In fact, just about every emerging economy, whether it comes to stock market crashes, or coming to currency collapses, or the scaling down, as Patrick said, of projections for economic growth. So it's clear at that level that the sort of extreme form of the decoupling thesis has been denied, in a sense, has been rejected by empirical events, by what's happened. But I think it's important to dwell a bit more on this, not to say that's history now, because I think there was a crucial misunderstanding in and a misleading aspect of that whole decoupling discussion. Because to say that decoupling hasn't happened in that extreme form does not mean that we should conclude that the arguments or the critics of decoupling have been vindicated in what they said and what they presumed. Because, certainly not all of them, because an important supposition of the to and fro, could the emerging economies be immune or not, was the idea that the decoupling scenario would be a test for how far China, India, other emerging economies had developed. And that somehow, if decoupling didn't happen, if we had the sort of events which we're seeing today, then that would prove that really these economies hadn't progressed all that much. That really a lot of it was froth. That really a lot of it was quite fragile, and you know, PR hype from the Chinese and the Indian and other sort of foreign ministries talking up how much was going on. That really it would expose that the level of development was quite shallow and not substantial, and not really on a par with real production and real activity, which we have, of course, back home in the West. Now, I think that was based on a fundamental misunderstanding and based on a false counterposition between development and dependence. Because there was a sort of idea that they were in inverse relationships, that if an economy was proven to be dependent on events outside its borders, then somehow that was proof that it was not a very developed economy, and vice versa. The more developed you are, then that would be proof that actually Asia had gone a considerable distance. That is a false counterposition. In fact, the opposite is more often the case, that development and dependence on the world economy go in tandem. That in fact, I would say it is a sign of the stage and the maturity of development, particularly in China, particularly in the four tigers, which you know have fallen away a bit in terms of Korea and Taiwan and Singapore and Hong Kong, but also to a lesser extent India. It is the very factor that they have been impacted by the storm from the West, which confirms that they are now far along the road of economic development, because they are much more integrated into the rest of the world. I mean, if you want to say who is the most, or which is the most dependent country in the world, I would say that's self-evidently the most developed country in the world, namely the United States, and not just in terms of its reliance on capital flows recently. So the most advanced and integrated economy in the world has most interlinking relationships and linkages with the rest of the world. And that really goes through the whole spectrum of developed economies. Take Japan, given we're looking and focusing on Asia. Japan, the second most developed economy in the world. Why has it been hit by the American credit problems and financial problems? Not because its banks are holding a lot of subprime mortgages. Its problems are because of the centrality of the Japanese currency, the yen, to global markets. And it has been, there's been this a phenomenon known as the carry trade going on, whereby because of the aftermath of the Japanese troubles over the financial troubles over the 1990s, interest rates are very low there, and so there's been a great opportunity to borrow in yen and to sell your yen and invest in high-yielding currencies elsewhere. And now that that is all unfolding and unwinding because of the credit crisis, the Japanese economy has been hit, not least because of the sort of accelerating upwards of the yen, causing big problems for its exporters. Take Korea, South Korea. It has been hit, not because it's a weak economy, but precisely because of the dependence and the interaction between the Korean banking sector and the Western banking sector. It's so developed as Korea that it actually operates pretty much as a traditional Western banking economy. So when you have the freeze in wholesale banking flows in the West, then that impacts on Korea as well. The Korean banks cannot borrow the money, and that has precipitated the crisis there. And you can go through to look at India, or an economy which maybe only 5% of GDP is accounted for by IT. Maybe it's only 1.5 million people, or 1 million, 1.3 million. But that outsourcing relationship, which is only a part of the IT sector, of course, but those relationships between India and the rest of the world means that when the companies for which India is providing IT services slow down, then that is bound to have an impact within India. And finally, on China, an economy whose export dependence is overstated. I might come back to that later in the discussion. But the reality is that about 10% of value added in China is based upon exports. Exports have been responsible for 2.5% of those 10, 12% growth rates over the last few years. So if you have European and American markets drying up and everyone retrenching, then it is bound to have an impact. So all that indicates, that I would say, is that actually, we're looking beneath the decoupling thesis, we can actually see that this global character of the recession, the global character of the financial crisis, to me vindicates that the stage of development which those economies have achieved. Far from the global recession sort of exposing the fragility of what's been going on in China and India, it actually shows the opposite. Just a little test, I don't know if people know, which are the two stock markets which have actually decoupled from the world economy over the last year? Which two stock markets have risen while the whole rest of the world has seen their stock markets fall?
Tunisia and Lebanon?
Very good, yes. Man read the FT 2 days ago. Tunisia and Lebanon, now I'm not an expert in either of those economies, but it's a sort of a reverse indication. These are hardly the two most integrated economies in the world. They're a bit on the side. Lebanon, had its big problems, of course, and Tunisia. But, decoupling then, this doesn't mean that they're the most developed economies in the world. As I say, it's more likely to be the obverse. So, to conclude then, the global character of this recession, I think, does not in any way challenge or refute the idea of the rapidity and the substance and the solidity of the developments which have taken place, particularly within China, but through that, China as the powerhouse for the East Asian region. But actually, in fact, the character of the global recession does highlight how much the most important thing that is happening, which is this shift of economic strength from one part of the world to the other, which is really the most important question facing us over the next 10, 15 years, the shift from west to east. Because if you look at it, just take one obvious point, if we were meeting here 10 years ago, we'd have been discussing a global financial crisis emanating from East Asia. We'd have been looking at the epicenter as being in Bangkok and being in Jakarta and so on. Where is the epicenter for this global financial crisis, this global recession? It's not Mumbai, it's not Shanghai even, it's not Seoul. It is, of course, Wall Street. It is, of course, New York is the epicenter for this global hurricane. And that's a very telling metaphor for how the power in the world has shifted. Also means, I've got 1 more minute? 1 more minute. Also means if you look at, and there'll be a lot of discussion about this, and it's important to get beneath it, but if you look at what's going to be going on over the next 6 months in terms of the symptoms of the global slowdown on the emerging economies, on China, on India, rest of South and East Asia, some of the discussion will appear to seem very similar in terms that the symptoms of the recession look quite similar. Currency problems, as I say, growth slowing down, stock markets being extremely volatile and so on. But it's extremely important to see and to understand that that epicenter was somewhere else rather than this time. The forms, the expressions of the recession and the slowdown may look the same, but underneath it, the cause is fundamentally different. The cause of the problems in the West are homegrown. They're in that banking, emerging financial crisis within the West, which other sessions here will be looking at over the next couple of days. The problems in the emerging economies are entirely spillover problems. They are not intrinsic to those economies. They're not intrinsic to what's going on in the region. There is no banking crisis within Asia. They are the spillover effects because of the integration and the positive sign of that integration of those economies into the world. So I think while we look through what is going to be, I think, a very dislocated, a very disrupted period in the emerging economies, not just for the next few weeks, but possibly for the next few months, possibly the next few years, you are going to see big dislocations. China could take a much bigger hit than people are saying at the moment. But underneath that, working away underneath, I think it would be very wrong to conclude that somehow these developments are arresting the shift of economic power from west to east. Much more likely, we're going to see underneath it all, over the next months, and importantly over the next 4 or 5 years, as the world works its way through this, we're going to see an acceleration of those trends, and we're going to see a situation in 3-4 years' time where India and China are even further advanced with respect to their position in the world economy.
Thank you very much. And finally, Xiaolan.
Good morning, everyone. My fellow panelists have already given their insightful comments on this topic. And here, what I'm going to give are some observations. I'm not going to comment or draw conclusion based on them. I believe everybody here, the audience, everybody will have your own judgment. There's an old Chinese saying, we say, I throw out a brick in the hope to give the appearance of a jade. So I hope the observations that I will give will trigger some thoughts or debates later on. The first observation is about growth. I think everybody many people maybe already know that last week the newest release of the GDP figure by the National Statistics Bureau of China shows that over the past 3 decades, the average annual GDP growth rate is 9.8%, which is much higher than the world average at 3%, which is similar to a little bit higher than those for Japan and Korea during their takeoff period. And normally, for a long time, the drivers of this growth are external demand, exports, foreign direct investment, and public expenditure. However, the recent study that I have done using a large census scale longitudinal data for the period 2000-2005 at firm level, what I have found is the major drivers of the GDP of the TFP growth, the productivity growth in China during the past 5 years, the main driver is technical change rather than efficiency improvement. So this is a signal, shows that the nature of growth, the quality of growth started to change in China. But instead of inputs driven, now is technology driven. This is a change, of course, still a gap to that of the US and the West. And the second observation is about development aspect. Last year, I went back to China to a remote mountainous area, which most of the residents are ethnic minority. Tujia is a mountainous, very remote area, very poor, one of the poorest area in China. I was there 23 years ago when I was an undergraduate student. And last year I went back, we drove to there. So rather than take train or flight, we drove there to see, take from the motorway A road or B road, try to see. That area normally people use in the wooden houses and without any decent windows. And last year I desperately to find these wooden houses. Unfortunately, very, very rare I can find these wooden houses. What I can see around the road and in the countryside are brick-built, 2-floor small houses. Very rare. Whenever I find a wooden house, I try to take a picture. It becomes so rare. So I have been very conservative, very cautious about the development aspect. But last year, this experience, this trip, made me changed somewhat my view about development, the impact of reforms and openness on development in China. Really, the poverty, the figures show 300 million people were lifted from poverty, under the poverty line to above it, during the past 3 decades. This is the second observation. The third observation, my trip to China again last month. I went first to Guangdong, the southeast province, then to Zhejiang, Shanghai, and then to China, along the coastal region. What I have found is there is a wave of closure of small and medium-sized enterprises and those export-oriented processing trade factories. It's a wave of closure, and the reason this started before the financial crisis, and the reason is the increasing labor prices, increasing land prices, increasing material, increasing energy prices, and also the appreciation of the exchange rate. Exchange rate appreciated for 20% over 1 year period, from 7.4 to 6.8. So the factories, the small firms, become more and more difficult, especially those outward-oriented firms. And what happened is different from what happened in the UK. The firm is going to close, and the employees will be given maybe 1 month notice, and you will be paid for 3 months. But in China, for those small factory owners, those capitalists, they may disappear over the night. The employees have no indication, no idea, and the second day they found, oh, the factory is closed. And even they can't receive even their salary for this month, or maybe even for last month. So this is, we know there are demonstrations already happening in China. Those unemployed workers lose their job and haven't get their salaries they deserve. They demonstrate. And the local government, what they can do at this moment, what I have seen, is they try to use the factory's assets, the boss left there, as a collateral to borrow some money from the bank and pay the salary. But this is a way it's starting. And the orders from the US and Europe already declined. And they expect in the next 1 or 2 quarters, the order from East Asia, Southeast Asia will also decline. So very difficult the time for the export-oriented firms, for the small and medium enterprises, and also in China, I won't talk more, just mention there are environmental issues, water, energy constraints, and also the inequality in the society, those kind of discontents in the society. Observation 4 is 4 weeks ago I went to Washington. I was in Brookings. This is the day when US government announced that the real figure about the unemployment GDP figure. And before that day, many people think this is still a financial crisis. But when the real GDP unemployment figure come out, many top economists, then they recognize, they confirm this is now starting to be economic crisis. And people talk about China's role because China has a huge foreign exchange reserve of 1.9 trillion now. This month is 1.9 trillion. So we can see it's not short of money, short of what? Skills, highly skilled people. So they dare not to buy it. They don't understand this business. They can't move on. Okay, finally, a very brief observation about India. India has 2 world-class industries, software and pharmaceutical. And also they have some sectors moving very forward, like we can see, even in the countryside, people use mobile phones. I have a project in India using mobile phones as a platform to enhance the delivery of agricultural services. However, for this project, we have lots of farmers. They're illiterate. We have to design the platform in a way using symbols because the users are illiterate, using symbols so that they can understand. So there are huge contrasts in India. They have elite, very good industries, and also there is it's considered the proportion of society who are illiterate, and we can see in Mumbai, in the financial street, just maybe very nearby, the very high buildings, there are very poor people living there. So I think in India, also internally, there are problems, especially the balanced growth for India to solve. These are the observations. I believe everyone will make your judgment based on these observations.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I will be going out to the floor very, very shortly, but I would like to just kind of kick the discussion off by just asking you a couple of questions. My first one's for Phil, but then I'd like to kind of get feedback from other panellists on their views on this. Now Phil, firstly, both Sundeep and Adrian talk about the fact that if India and China are going to grow to the extent that is anticipated, there is going to be a massive kind of fight for natural resources. So Sundeep says the West has got to get used to not being a monopoly buyer of resources, and Adrian talks about the potential kind of 1984 scenario due to kind of in part the massive rise in the price of natural resources. I was just wondering, do you think this could be you talk about the shift of power and certainly economic development to the east. Do you think this fight for resources is going to be something that could potentially hinder growth in both west and east?
Well, I think the rebalancing of the world, bringing politics into line with economics, is going to be a very difficult process, and there will be lots of friction, there will be lots of tension, and people may well use resources as a focus for that, as a sort of form in which some of these battles are worked through. But my general take on the anxieties about resource depletion and so on, or about resource constraints, is is not. I don't accept those general problems. I think it is a symptom of quite a widespread sort of Malthusian type view, which is very dominant today, which is a fairly sort of fatalist view on the world. Just to remind you, in terms of Malthus, who was the first proponent of this idea that basically the world would run out of food as its population grew, and you'd have massive famine and war and starvation and so on. And it was a view which was denied, rejected, refuted by the passage of history, for one simple reason, in that it did not take into account humanity's capability and ability to raise productivity and to actually address its own interests using whatever resources were around. So productivity in agriculture and later in industry created the means by which society was able to not just avoid starvation and avoid the depletion of resources, but able to move forward. I have a similar take on those who worry about the running out of resources today. I mean, if you look back at the last 100 years, there's every sort of 10, 15 years, there's an anxiety about running out of oil or about running out of coal and so on, or some particular resource will not be there. And the reality is that those extrapolations of depletion, and therefore the conflicts which are being postulated as coming out of them, do not arise because of rising productivity, because society is able to resolve those things. And so my general take on it is that, in fact, the bringing of China, India, and the other leading emerging economies into the world economy is bringing in a resource, a capability, a possibility of applying human ingenuity to whatever difficulties are thrown up, whether they're social difficulties or natural difficulties or whatever. I believe that necessity is a driver for innovation and change and progress, and so far humanity has proved a very good expression of how that works itself through. So I feel that they will be, in a sense, the problem solvers rather than the problem makers. They will be the ones who will be at the driving edge of the new technological innovations, the new efficiency, energy efficiency innovations and so on, to allow us to continue what's already happening, but probably with more gusto than has been the case before. Energy efficiency will increase, there'll be less wastage, less pollution out of that because of technological advance.
Can I just I'd just like to see if Sundeep agrees with that. I mean, do you think that there can be a tendency to over-exaggerate these concerns, and that the ingenuity of the Chinese, the Indian people, and kind of the humans' ability to actually deal with these problems means that a lot of these kind of nightmare scenarios that you suggested may not actually come about?
Yeah, there's a kind of debate here between Malthus and Ricardo, actually. But a couple of things are also true. See, there were similar kind of apprehensions which were expressed at the time when Japan, Korea, etc. were also developing post the war. The only difference now between, I think, what's happening now and what has ever happened in the past is that you never actually had 1/5 of the world, 1/3 of the world's population doing it. I mean, Japan, Korea, etc. all put together about 1/5 of the population of China and India. The second thing, which is also actually true, if I remember reading somewhere, is that this is the first time after the 1800s when commodity prices have actually increased. Otherwise, by and large, most of the growth that has happened, which has happened in the West and so on and so forth over the last 200 odd years, the prices of commodities have actually been coming down because of efficiencies, because of productivity, because of new sources, because that's why they went out and colonized various parts of the world in order to get resources at lower prices. Now, what the impact of this would be, only time will tell. And I think a bit of everything is going to be true. There will be friction, there will be muscle bending and so on, and I think there will be greater efficiencies. I mean, today, for example, the US, which complains and fights war over oil, consumes twice as much per capita oil as Japan, which is equally developed. And I'm sure some of these efficiencies, etc., will start kicking in, and they will have to kick in because otherwise they won't be able to keep their houses warm. There is a big concern about, let's say, food prices and so on and so forth, but the actual impact on an average American consumer of increasing food prices over the last couple of years is actually 6% of his income. Now, most Americans can probably eat 6% less.
Thank you. Now, before I give a fellow chance to respond to that, I'd just like to ask Adrian a question. Now, Adrian, you suggested that by 2050, China's standard of living will actually have caught up to the standard of living that we see in the West now. Xiaolan, I thought, brought out some concerns that there's a possibility that this growth wouldn't be kind of balanced internally, and actually you could get pockets of areas in both kind of India and China where you will still get extreme poverty that you wouldn't really see in the West. When you say that China will have this standard of living, do you actually mean the whole of China or particular areas?
Well, I actually interpreted Xiaolan as saying exactly the opposite. She'd gone back to an area that had been incredibly poor 23 years ago, and she thought would not have progressed, and it actually had progressed. So, the answer is yes, I think everybody in India and China will catch up in the sense that, in 2050, the income distribution in China is going to look very like the income distribution in most developed countries. No, in the sense that a lot of poor people in China now and in India will have died long before that happened. And no, also in the sense that there are a lot of people in India and China going to lose as a result of this process of development. Development is about change. Rapid change is very nasty. It's very brutal. A lot of people lose. But, in the long run, you're going to get to a situation in which, there will be no bigger pockets of poverty in China and India than there are in the United States or the UK.
And a challenge, I think Adrian's probably right in terms of interpreting you there, but in terms of kind of infrastructural concerns, do you think that China and, India in particular, are actually making the right steps in terms of being able to progress and get up to that Western standard at the moment? You talked about the problems, for example, with a skills shortage in kind of key areas. Do you think that there is a vision for how that can actually be achieved at the moment and implemented?
I think the economic growth and also the very optimistic predictions about China can be achieved based on some conditions. There are some conditions. First is whether there are technological, revolutions or technological significant progress to solve the energy problem. Otherwise, energy will be one of the trigger for instability in the whole world. I think this is one constraint. Not only energy, but also water. Like in China, many of the waters were polluted. People can't drink it and can't use this water to water the plants. So these are hard constraints and they really become a significant issue. I think this calls for efficiency improvements and also calls for technological revolution, innovations. Only this can solve this problem because this is only one world, only one Earth, and everybody, all the countries in the world want to progress. So I think this is one. And another issue for China is whether there are effective policies to balance the growth, to redistribute the gains from growth and reform to the relatively more equally to the society, and to balance the regional disparities, rural-urban disparities, and also the inequalities between people. There are huge social discontent within China. I think the government has realized this. They're moving to the right direction. They're now facing the economic crisis. Two new policies can come out. First is encourage domestic consumption. I think this is the right direction. Rather than competing in the national market, encourage domestic consumption. The second is agriculture, rural area. This is their main focus. But really depends on whether the policy is effective. It's not easy. Like for China to encourage consumption, you need the country. Traditionally, the culture is people like saving rather than spending. This is very different from the US. And also, people dare to spend. It's not to say you encourage, tell you to spend. People don't spend. Also, they have their worries. They worry about pensions, about unemployment, about healthcare now reformed. You have to pay everything yourself, and your education now commercialized. You have to pay for your kids' education. So people worried about all this, and they dare not to spend. So real encouragement of domestic consumption really calls for a series of complementary reforms. Then people dare to spend.
Thanks very much. Now I'm very keen to go out to the floor and get some questions. I'm going to take a round of questions, probably about 6 or 7 questions, and then get some feedback from the panellists, and then we'll go out again. So please keep your hand up, and if you could just introduce yourself and say who you are the first time you speak, that'll be really helpful. So if I could first take the guy just sitting there, and I'll take the guy just on the right-hand side after that.
Adrian Wood. My question is about this currency exchange called currency reserves held in China and India. I think the top 5 Asian nations account for over 51% of the world's currency reserves. Also, as I understand it, in Southeast Asia, these home savings rates are something like 30% of take-home is actually saved. 20 to 30% is saved by households. This is very different from the picture in Europe and the USA. To what extent do these two phenomena insulate potentially these nations against a global recession? And might that extend their vaulting these other economies?
Thanks very much. The guy just over there.
Hi, is this on? Yeah. My name is Martin Burtz. I'm chairing a session tomorrow called Brave New World, looking at Western attitudes to Chinese technology development, so quite relevant to today. My question or sort of angle is, I think we also have to be quite balanced about the nature of Chinese development, in particular how it seems to be, in my view, very dependent, perhaps in a potentially bad way, on Western technology and Western intellectual know-how, at least for the time being, because it seems throughout China, in my limited understanding, there are obviously many kind of technology and science parks which are actively inviting people like IBM, Hewlett-Packard, and all the rest to basically port their innovation from the West into China. And what seems to be happening is that, although that's going on, there seems to be very little local, if you like, technology transfer from those Western companies back into the Chinese economy and into the Chinese community. So although they're sort of benefiting from the know-how of the Western companies, it doesn't seem to me, in my view, that there is necessarily a large amount of actually Chinese-led innovation on their own terms. So that obviously has a very direct impact, in my view, on ongoing Chinese development. And finally, the real problem for me is that the more the Chinese rely on the West to give them the ideas, you know that's going to be a problem, because we in the West, we don't necessarily like that much development ourselves, because you know one day they'll be exporting sustainability, environmentalism, all the rest of it, which will probably shut down any really innovative ideas in China for the time being.
Thanks very much. If you could just take the microphone up there, and we'll have the lady up there in green.
2 quick questions. One is, and it was mentioned at on the platform about China's growing old population, if you like. most people would acknowledge that China and India are growing very fast, but would sort of pinpoint that compared to India, China's population will grow too quickly. I'd quite like your comments on that, because my view is that China actually is relaxing, has relaxed already its one-child policy, and will endeavour to deal with it. And India's population is young, but illiteracy and other problems may stop it going developing faster. The second question is very much more specific to India. The conflicts between commercial capital versus state. So if you look at even Tata and its recent ventures to try and build something, I'd quite like some comments on that, because it is well known that India's got quite a lot of state laws, its labour laws. It's quite difficult for private capital to move forward very quickly. It'd be just interesting to know where you stand on that.
Thanks very much. If you could bring that microphone down to the middle there, and we have the gentleman just there with the pink shirt.
My name's Daniel Benami. I'm speaking at the later session of the series. Just a brief point on energy prices, natural resource prices. I think it's completely one-sided to suggest the reason the trend of these has been upwards is because of demand from India and China and emerging economies. I mean, it is the case, of course, that Chinese industrialization and Indian economic use of resources, the use of resources is increasing. But to me, the big problem is that investment in supply hasn't kept up with that. If there was investment in supply, more ingenuity, more technological development, there's no reason why there couldn't be plentiful cheap resources. If you look at America, for example, it still uses almost 3 times as much oil as China. That's not per person, that's in total, despite its lower population. America hasn't built a nuclear power station since the 1970s. It hasn't built an oil refinery since the 1970s. They're just 2 indications that there just isn't enough investment going into supply of resources. If there is that investment, then there's no reason why commodity prices shouldn't stay low.
Thanks very much. If you could bring the microphone down to the guy in the maroon shirt there, and yeah.
Hi, my name's Joe Vandor, and I'm a volunteer with World Ride. This is a question that ties into a comment from Sundeep, quite a passing one, in his opening speech about the fourth march of industrialisation in China. You tend to hear a lot about slum clearances and forced movement of people in the interest of development in China. Do you think this is a really serious issue by people in China, or is it something that people tend to accept as a kind of trade-off for future economic growth?
Sorry, if you give the microphone to the lady next to you, and yes.
Hi, I'm Dan Travis. I'm from the Bright Salon. I've got a question about if the emerging economies are export driven, aren't they completely dependent on the global economy itself? And there, to me, seems to be a contradiction. Where does this leave, say, the opportunity for manoeuvre within the domestic economy? If you are dependent on, for example, Western purchasing power, Western consumers, and conversely, Western consumers are dependent on capital flows from the East, then surely your room for manoeuvre, independence and political independence as well, is limited.
If you could pass the mic to the gentleman just behind you there, and take Sheila Lewis there.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sheila Lewis. I'm chairing a session on what is China thinking tomorrow. Sorry. I just wanted to question Phil, actually, on a point that he made about necessity as a driver of innovation, because it seems to me that might leave out the political side, which is that there's a danger, and I can observe it now, there's a danger that people say rather than innovate and use technology to progress, actually what's being argued for is that, in a sense, we curb our ambitions and we slow down and we stop, basically, go backwards. You know, there was a lot of criticism about the car being introduced into Shanghai and bicycles being removed, and that they're saying, okay, actually China should have bicycles and not cars. And it seems to me there's a danger that is a prevalent political view today, and that there's 2 problems with it. Obviously, because it means humanity's going backwards and not forwards, but also if you stop the drive for economic development and development generally, then you can't develop the technological that Xiaolin referred to. You need technological innovation to solve the problems that China had. And there's a huge political lobby in China, the environmental lobby particularly, that's saying, you know, you should stop developing. And the thing that worries me most about what's going on in China, about the kind of political developments, is that they are now saying that economic growth is not the key driver any longer. We've got to think about other things. And it all sounds perfectly reasonable to have harmonised the Xiaolan society, the harmonised society. But actually what it's doing is saying we shouldn't concentrate on development and economic growth. We should start to curb our ambitions. And that to me is a worrying sign.
So I'm going to take 2 more points before returning back to the speakers, and then I'll be going out again afterwards for another round of questions. So if you could just bring the microphone down to Stuart Simpson, just down here, and this gentleman here.
Hello. Hello. I'm Eshan Hassan, and I'm volunteering for World Bank. Now I'm asking on what are the main setbacks that the emerging economies have in order to close the gap with the developed world, despite of their rapid growth rate. Because there's technology, China and India, and along with others in the developing world, they have quite bigger technologies now. But the West, on the other hand, they have like resources. So is it a matter of technology advancements, or is it the economy in terms of the resources which gets the wealth of the country to be richer or wise in economics?
Okay, thanks very much. Finally, Stuart.
It was 2 very quick questions, one to Adrian Wood and the other to Xiaolan. I've never heard anyone before seriously suggest that within 50 years China and India will meet Western living standards. I've heard people say that China and India will be the largest economies, but when you started talking, Adrian, I was very infused by what you were saying. I thought that sounds really impressive. But then when you went on to say that actually the way that they'll achieve this, I was trying to work out in my head, what rates of growth would China and India need to see? It would be much higher than 10%. But then you talked about what the way they achieve this is through slowing the growth within the developed world. And the question I'd like to ask is one of the reasons I'm concerned with looking at growth within developing economies and championing growth around the world is because I don't think we have enough here in the West. I don't think we're wealthy enough here to start off with. So I'm very concerned that your description of the West living off rents, technological rents that we use, do you think we actually have a greater proportion of the global economy than we actually deserve in the West, even now? Is that the implication of what you're saying? Second question I'd like to ask, which relates to a question that was previously asked about the nature of China's growth and the talk of moving from a focus on the expansive growth to particular types of growth, strength rather than scale within China's economic development. I move towards high-value services and high-value manufacturing away from lower-end manufacturing, textiles, and that thing, moving towards higher-value industries. I was wondering if you could talk about whether you think that the current economic crisis will actually throw that project into difficulties. China's obviously been restricting growth of certain industries to promote growth of others. So rising the value of the renminbi is marginally benefits higher value manufacturing versus lower value manufacturing. But if China now has to deal with the fact that it's got to pump prime its economy and keep lower value industries open, is that going to be a problem for the future development of China?
Thanks, Stuart. Lots on the table there. If I could potentially start with Adrian for your comments.
Thank you. Let me respond immediately to Stuart's questions. It's addressed very much at me. Yes, I think it will happen. I mean, 2050 is, well, I don't know, maybe 10 years more, 10 years less. But you've got to think about not only what is happening to the growth rates of GDP as conventionally measured, but what is happening to the real exchange rates of these economies. Think of how quickly Japan caught up. It was less than 100 years. And it depends what you think the starting points were of China versus Japan, and when you actually think China started. But I don't think this 2050 figure is unrealistic. Now, does that mean, in some sense, and as I said, I'm not. The West is not going to get poorer, and it's just not going to get richer anything like as fast as it has been over the last 3 decades. Now, is the West in some sense wealthy enough already? I don't know. All I do know, maybe just one interesting statistic, is that we know that as income per capita has risen in the United States over the last 30 years, happiness, subjective well-being, on average, has not changed. So, you want to think about, what is enough? I care about subjective well-being. I think we have plenty enough money for subjective well-being if we use it appropriately.
Thanks, Adrian. If I could bring in Sundeep now.
Yeah, well, there were some questions specifically for me, and there was just some other observations. I'll start with the second first. One is someone had mentioned about the fact that the technological development within China is not happening at the same rate. And I think that is a worry for China. And I think one of the things that comes in the way, which they are concerned about, is the intellectual properties. A lot of Western companies are reluctant to actually share first generation and innovative technologies with Chinese companies because they're very concerned that these are going to find their way into the open market. And India is a great beneficiary of that because in India they don't have a similar concern. And I think China has of late increased, in fact it's going to overtake US as the largest investor into research and development as a percentage of their GDP very shortly. And that is definitely something they're looking at. They've also for the first time apparently given permission that research papers can be published on the net by Chinese researchers, which has never again happened before. So I think there is a growing concern, growing realization, and hopefully that might. There was another comment made regarding the state and the recent example, I think lady there, where Nano project of the Tatas, which is such a well-known project, was literally thrown out of one state because of land acquisition issues. But the good thing was that within 10 days it was up and running in another state. So I think, while there are issues in the sense that, yes, and this will only create disparities between states, and it is already creating disparities between states. There are some states within India which probably will reach per capita incomes which are of Western standards, as the professor's statement, and there will still remain some states within India which will be where Lebanon and Tunisia perhaps and have good share markets. But at the end of it, I think this is a process of flux, and I think at the end of it, these states which are more advanced states will pull the others up because those people are not going to stand for it. And there's another movement which has started within India, which is disturbing, but which will go towards making this happen, which is why the richer states have now started resenting that people from poorer states are coming into the richer states to get jobs. Now, when this happens and the people from the poorer states are unable to go to the richer states as comfortably to get jobs, then they will that much more demand within their own states that, guys, if you can't deliver, I vote you out.
Actually, I'm going to have to bring in Xiaolan at this point, I think, to ensure that we get lots more questions from the floor. Thank you.
Maybe I respond to 3 questions related to China. Maybe first come to the last question about the nature of China's growth and the attempts and the efforts to upgrade the industry from the lower end of the value chain to the higher end of the value chain. This has been there has been continuous effort on this, and the current situation, I think, is a result of a policy in the 1980s. The 2 ends outside is the resources outside, market outside, 2 ends outside policy, which encouraged cross-section trade. And now there is a renewed emphasis on indigenous innovation and technology upgrading. So this financial crisis and this industrial, I think this structural change started before this financial crisis. Lots of SMEs closed down. I know many processing type firms in the coastal regions closed down. And actually, I think on one side there is a negative side, and on the other hand, for the government, I think it is a push to push the regions, the cities, and the firms to upgrade. You don't upgrade, you don't innovate, you don't find a specific segment, niche in the market, you won't survive. So it's a big push, and this squeezes out some inefficient firms. It's a very painful process, but may result in a more competitive economy. This is also what my view about the economic crisis currently in US and the West. And we all know there are bad sides, but there is a good side in the way that it squeezes out some unhealthy elements, bubbles in the economy, and like you have run very long, and you have a stop, adjust, have a break, and run further. So I won't take this crisis completely negative. About innovation in China, yeah, I think this is a very interesting question. In China, China has used this market, trading market for technology strategy. Open market attract foreign direct investment in the hope to get the advanced technology. But this 30 years experience showed it seems the core technology is still controlled in the foreign firms. And the domestic firms, the spillover effect is really limited. And even we found negative competition crowding out effects. And the research that I have mentioned, that I use census scale, firm level longitudinal data, what I find is in the economy, the industries, we have low tech, middle tech, and high tech industry. In China, there has been a renewed emphasis on indigenous innovation. The investment in R&D growth is like this, exponential. In recent 10 years, they invest a lot. And what I found from this large data set is in the low and medium tech sector, is indigenous firms dominate the technology frontier. The private firms and the shareholding companies dominate the frontier. And in the high tech sector, it's the foreign firms dominate the frontier. So if we look at more details as the industry, then we can see there are indigenous firms that are coming up, and they are creating appropriate technology for countries.
I think I'm going to have to cut you off there. Sorry if I can, before I go to the floor, Phil.
Okay. Quick point on the relative living standards question. I agree one point with Adrian, which is that I think one shouldn't underestimate how fast living standards have risen in the countries which have been developing. If you look at South Korea compared to 40 years ago, if you look at Malaysia compared to 25 years ago, and so on, the gap between Western and Asian living standards can move very, very quickly. And that is what is happening at the moment. Where I don't agree with Adrian is I don't think that means that the West has to hold back. Not only do I not subscribe to the new Malthusianism, I don't subscribe to the new austerity which we're having imposed upon us. I mean, I've got a decent standard of living, decent salary, I don't have enough, and I think most people in this room, if they think about it, don't have enough. We need higher living standards in the West, and even higher, more rapidly increasing living standards in Asia. That should be our global aspiration for a better life for all, not for weighing up between them. I want to focus mainly on the export question, because that's one of the myths about developments, I think, within Asia in particular, the reliance on Western exports. There's two misleading aspects of that. Firstly, is that if we look at trade, which clearly trade is becoming an increasingly important part of the world economy, trade is growing faster, as we all know, than GDP is growing. But the really rapid growth in trade in the last sort of 7 or 8 years has been trade within the emerging and developing world. That you've had, while the emerging economies now have grown from about a fifth of, responsible for a fifth of trade to about a third, the most rapidly growing part has been within the emerging economies. The growth in trade volumes has been led by the Asian economies. And within that the intra-Asian trade has been the fastest growing of all. So the idea of a dependence on Western markets is exaggerated and is misleading. Two tipping points have happened. Firstly, it's worth noting that China has replaced the United States as the major export destination for most of the emerging economies, certainly for all of developing Asia, for Japan, for the newly industrialized economies. So, more trade is going into China than it is going to the United States. The other tipping point, which is just happening at the moment, is that as China as a source of exports, now more than half of the exports go to the rest of the developing world rather than to the developed economies. That 50% mark has just been passed, or is on the verge of being passed. So it indicates that the dependence on the West is exaggerated. Second point on this is that the sort of headline figures we often see for China of 40% of exports is the equivalent of, or exports the equivalent of 40% of GDP is misleading because it is measuring apples against oranges. It's measuring a measure of gross output, the value of the sales revenue that comes from the exports, with GDP, which is a value-added measure. Very interesting sort of study, or it was represented in the Economist a few months ago, which shows that if you compare apples with apples, value added from exports in China as opposed to value added in the rest of the economy, actually the percentage of dependence on exports is only 10%. And of that then, because US is becoming a less important market for China, only about 2% of value added in China actually goes to the United States. So the idea of the Walmart effect as being the dominant form of exports in China is also wrong. So 90% of value added in China comes domestically through the investment, the internal accumulation going, which I think does reinforce the point I was making earlier, that you do have many, many more interrelationships between economies, but that interrelationship and integration in the world and that dependence in the world does not mean that you're at the whim of the rest of the world.
Thanks very much, Phil. Then bring that mic down to the back there. There's a cluster of hands up there.
Hi, my name is Bob Harris. I'm on the volunteer worldwide. I just want to bring up Adrian on his point about subjective well-being. I was wondering at what point does sort of growth stop being important? He says that by 2050 China and India will be as rich as we are today, but we also have studies today about how people in Britain are no happier than we were 50 years ago. So perhaps is there more to growth than happiness, or perhaps we should start getting worried around 2030?
The guy in the blue shirt right at the back, and if you could bring this mic to the front here, to this guy here.
Alan Miller from the New York Salon. I want to address the point to Sundeep's introduction again, because when you were asking how many planets we need, and also to what extent economic growth is the real calculus for development per se, I think when we look at China and India catching up with the West and perhaps superseding it, it's not just an objective consideration about investment, although that's very important. It's also the ideas that permeate that discussion. And whenever we're talking about China and India, it's generally in the context of things have gone too far, we need more sustainable development, we need to have limits to growth because we're getting a bit out of control, avaricious and greedy. And even though there's a certain ambition and there's a certain recognition they have some fluidity there to invest, I think our ideas are impacting them at the level of NGOs, at the level of big corporations. And I would suggest that we need to win also the battle of ideas internationally with them to challenge the notion that we're going too far, because otherwise catching up with the West and superseding it will not happen, and I think that's the most exciting thing that can be done. So that's the question.
Right, if you could just pass the mic forward to the people just in front of you there. If we take a gentleman here.
Yeah, I've seen on Adrian's point, the comparison with Japan. To come back to Sandeep's point he made with sort of saying that Japan is not at all comparative with China or India today, just because of the massive difference in population. So, for example, the effect of China as a right, for example, that basically, in order to keep up, the West has to learn Chinese, the language, while so far we haven't had to learn Japanese. So, Japanese, we can cope with that and still remain keep Western hegemony, while the Chinese and Indian market's growing. That is going to challenge Western hegemony in a different way.
Thanks very much. You could just pass the mic to the lady next to you there, and the point at the back there. Yep.
Just a point, Professor Wood mentioned that in 1500 the reason why they fell behind were complicated reasons. I thought they were fairly obvious in terms of Britain using military power to totally transform their economies and actually take control themselves. A recent UN report showed about the trickle-down globalization not working in global cities. Surely a message, if China and India want to catch up, to look at America in terms of the military might they have to wield political influence and economic, is that they ought to be building up their military.
So we've got a lady here. Unfortunately, we've only got time for 2 more points. We're going to have the gentleman here and then the lady down here at the front.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth from the Economic and Social Research Council. Both India and China have issues with gender inequality, and especially they've got a disparity between the number of women compared to the number of men. And gender inequality generally is a really big problem. Do you think that's one of the major issues that has to be addressed to kind of support the social side of development as well, rather than just the economic side of development?
Right. Point here, and if you could pass that microphone down to the front.
Point and then a question to Adrian. Adrian, on the subject of Japan and its ascendancy, I would put to you that was largely a function of the US's support, massive economic support and sponsorship of Japan as a bulwark against communism. China doesn't benefit from that. Secondly, everyone here is very bullish on Asia in general. I'd be interested to hear if the question the gentleman there wasn't answered. From each panelist, what is the major risk that none of this comes to fruition?
Thanks very much. And finally, Kerry Dingle here.
Kerry Dingle, Director of WorldRight. Can I just say very quickly, it's been so great to hear such insightful and exciting and quite inspiring introductions, all of which tell a very different story to what's told here in terms of how exciting and positive things really are in terms of China's and India's growth. But I did get a sense from you, except from Phil, that there was a rider on that. And I just wonder if your concluding remarks you could address that. So, for example, Adrian, you said there's losers in terms of the growth. Dr. Liu, you talked about more balance in terms of growth. Isn't really the issue the need for more and faster growth rather than, and maybe Sandy, we've already discussed the fears that you've suggested. More and faster growth rather than anything else. The fact is there's not enough of it. So I'd just really like to know if you think there's such a thing as bad growth, because we are faced with incredible anti-growth sentiment or growth scepticism. And surely one of the exciting things about China and India is we shouldn't be sceptical about growth, we should be celebrating it. And just love to know your thoughts on that.
Thanks very much. Now, I'm afraid we are at the time for concluding remarks now, so I'd like to do it in the reverse order of the order that you spoke. So if I could start to my far right with Xiaolan for about a minute's concluding remarks. A minute, yeah.
Many thanks for the very inspiring questions. I think maybe let me also give more response to the question related to growth. And actually earlier there are also questions about growth. I'm in favor. I would embrace growth. Growth will bring the whole society up, and as one of the maybe a consequence or byproduct, the people at the bottom end will be lifted above the poverty line. However, the growth, there is also a problem of the quality of growth, the nature of growth, the structure of growth, and also whether the gains from growth are equally distributed. I think this is the question. Growth is a good thing, but this growth, whether there are environmental issues, whether there are resource, especially energy cost, heavy wasting cost on energy, whether there are also is like whether there are high quality growth which focus on more dynamic industry, more sunrise industry rather than sunset industry, and also whether there are more clean, more high quality, high knowledge content growth. I think this is the kind of growth that in the Western society people pursue. And however, what happens in China and India at this stage in the past 3 decades, I think the growth, the quality, and the type is not this sort of type. I think they need to modify and improve the quality and structure of the growth. And another issue is to distribute the gains from growth more equally through the society. And I think these are the challenges forward.
Thanks very much, Xiaolan.
My key point is it's not decoupling, but it's A, divergence, and it's B, what some people call reverse coupling. So let me explain that in my minute. Divergence is straightforward, that the dynamics within the East versus the West are different. I'm bullish in the long term, just to qualify that, not qualify it in the sense that I'm not ambitious about growth, but I think the impact of this global recession is going to be quite severe in many parts of the emerging economies. And as I say, I think to some extent China could, and it's difficult to explain this in a minute, could actually benefit from having a bit of a shake-up as a result of this, because there are certain imbalances within the Chinese economy, and it could well be the case that even though China and many others go through a couple of years of difficulties as a sort of the spillover effect of this, it could actually strengthen them in the longer term. So bullish in the long term, but that's not to say everything's hunky-dory and there's going to be a lot of hardship and misery for people in emerging economies. I think we should recognise that. The East-West relationship is the one I want to talk about. I mean, I can understand an audience, predominantly people who live in Britain, live in the West, a lot of scepticism. That's one of the liabilities we have of living in this society. It's rather negative, passive, fatalist society. But I think there's a bit too much scepticism about the ambition side and about the sort of the capability of these economies to catch up technologically. Give them a bit of a break. They've made enormous gains in terms of technological advance. There is that investment going on. They are, learning. They're not so much copycatting as they are leapfrogging in certain areas. And I think that should be recognised. So while I do recognise the risks that both of you are saying, that others have indicated from the floor, that sort of the Western sort of negativity and pessimism can be a cultural influence on the emerging economies and can be negative, I think we should actually look at the opposite, to the extent to which, as Tony asked, couldn't the influence go the other way? And I think that's the really interesting question at the moment. To what extent could there be reverse coupling? That is, that what goes on in the East can actually have an impact within the West. And that should be looked at both economically and also intellectually. Economically it is happening. I mean, I'm in the telecom sector, and it is the case that what Western economies, what Western business have to do have to respond to what's happening in China and in other parts of Asia, in terms of what these telecom companies are doing based in China, what the telecom equipment companies are doing, Huawei and others are doing. That is driving the strategy of many Western telecom companies in a defensive way. It could actually become something which actually accelerates the restructuring of business in the West, which would be no bad thing given the status which it is at the moment. So there is an economic impact, but really at the battle of ideas, the most important question for us to discuss is to what extent could there be an intellectual reverse coupling? To what extent could the ideas, whatever the risk in terms of environmental and sort of negativity and sort of retrenchment, restraint type ideas from the West can have on the East, could what still exists, what is still there in terms of a kernel of aspiration and ambition for the future, could one of the fallouts of this global crisis in the West, in terms of a loss of, we have a loss of faith in capitalism in the West, we also loss of faith in terms of their intellectual leadership. The American century is over now, and in that context, the extent to which their ideas could actually shake up things in the West, I think is a very interesting one to pursue over the rest of the couple of days, and in fact, for the next few years, because the potential is there. The problem is that the West is proving itself very incapable of adapting to the opportunities there, and that's the job for us here. It's nothing to do with what people are doing and aspiring to do in China and the emerging economies. People in the West have to break down that resistance and that sort of cocooning which exists in the West, which makes people incapable of embracing opportunity and change. And that's the sort of lead we have to give to the battle of ideas.
Thanks very much, Phil. Save it closely, Adrian.
Thank you for your questions. I'd love to answer all the excellent questions that were put both to me and to other members of the panel. But let me make it very clear that the acceleration of growth in India and China is, in my view, the best thing that has happened in the world for a very, very long time. What I was saying about the relationship between income and subjective well-being is a relationship at high levels of income. There is no question but that rising from a very low level of income to an intermediate level of income definitely makes people much better off. And this has happened on a massive scale to a large number of very poor people. It's going to go on happening, and it's terrific. In developed countries, it's much, much more debatable. I hear Phil saying he wants a higher income. Why does he want a higher income? Because he can see other people now, today, who've got higher incomes than him. This is the dilemma.
Jonathan Ross is the one.
This is the dilemma. I mean, in a society, in a given society, at a given time, people with higher incomes are happier than people with lower incomes. So everybody struggles and struggles and struggles to get a higher income, and then you wind up a little later, on average, everybody's just as happy as they were before. That's a dilemma. Have a battle of ideas about that one.
And finally, Cindy.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of things. One is I don't think you can shut the door on 2.5 billion people. You know, it's damn tough for the rest of the world to try and shut the door on 2.5 billion people, and they shouldn't even try. I think the whole success of this century is going to depend on, as I said in my opening remarks, how well the West integrates India and China into the global economy, and how well India and China integrate themselves into the global economy. One good thing which is happening in some of the recent researches that have happened in our own country is that more and more Indians and Chinese are getting more proud with their own cultures. They're not necessarily looking at the West as the utopia that they all want to try and reach. And I think that's a good thing, because I don't think in many ways the West should define for a majority of people what the epitome of their achievement ought to be. And I think that is changing. And the last point I just want to make is that economic growth is necessary, but not a sufficient reason for getting social growth. I mean, there are many countries in this world which have very high per capita incomes, and are rich countries where none of us may necessarily want to live because they don't have freedoms, they don't have equality, gender equality, etc., etc. So economic growth is not a guarantee of social growth and happiness. And I think that's something that the India and China will do well to recognize. And I think our cultures and our history give us the strength and the ability to be able to recognize that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sundeep. Now, yes, if we could thank our speakers.